Now let's bring in two journalists. Adam Harris is a staff writer covering politics, the 2020 campaign, and more for The Atlantic. He recently wrote about how the pandemic could send local governments into fiscal crisis. Hey, Adam. And we're also joined by Amy Walter, the national editor of the Cook Political Report. She is also a host of WNYC's show, The Takeaway, and my former next-door office mate at the Watergate at National Journal and The Atlantic. Adam, Amy, good to see you both. Adam, let me start with you. Obviously, you know, because of the pandemic, the country is in a moment of chaos and uncertainty economically and in public health. Yet, as we were kind of talking about a little in that first panel, after all the gyrations of the past month, we've settled back into a world that looks very familiar, with Trump's approval rating somewhere around 45, 46%, Biden leading in almost, I think, all of the horse race polls that have been conducted since March 1st, and yet Trump competitive enough in the key swing states that you could easily imagine him finding a way to win the Electoral College, even if he doesn't win the popular vote. Do either of you think the structure of the race has changed in any fundamental way since the outbreak? Adam, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think that just looking, if you just think back to when all of this began, it was a completely different Democratic primary. First off, you had just purely more people in the Democratic primary race. I think that, so the fact that the Democratic primary has kind of come into shape, and it's Joe Biden and Trump right now, that's kind of the fundamental thing. But I actually think you need to look more down ballot at how things are going to change fundamentally. You're thinking about the Senate seats that are open or that are being challenged for, where a challenger might need to go out and do massive voter registration drives in order to win. You're thinking about people who are not currently occupying an office, who are running for congressional races against someone who is occupying an office, who might be able to just do their job as their campaign plank. So I think there are some very fundamental things about down ballot races that have changed more so than presidential.
And you share Cornell's belief that there is something of a thumb on the scale for incumbents in this environment because it's harder for challengers to get noticed and have their case heard? Or alternately, at a moment where wrong track is going up, that's not great for incumbents.
Absolutely. Well, I think that there is, I spoke with Lori Fegan. She's running for office out in Washington State. She's just running for one of the state seats. And she has moved from, campaigning. She just gotten campaign buttons, and now she's doing telehealth medicine 10 hours a day, because before she went over and tried to run for office, she was a nurse practitioner. So it's kind of changed what she's able to do. She's not going out and doing the Zoom conference calls. She's not able to go knock on doors. She's not able to have kind of the events anymore. But her argument is, this is what I can do to help my district. That's why I ran for office in the first place. And this is what I can do for the people of my district. So there is kind of for incumbents, I do think that there is a built-in, as long as you're doing your job, people can see you doing your job, it could be helpful. But outside of that, there is kind of space for challengers to do the things that they can in order to kind of get people.
Amy, different race or kind of back where the same as it's ever been?
Right. There's a yes and no to that, Ron. I mean, I completely agree with the way that you set this up, and the previous panel talked about, this sort of equilibrium where we've been with Donald Trump from the very beginning of his presidency, and the stability even in the matchups with Joe Biden. What has changed, and the Electoral College map, I don't think has really changed all that much either. To me, what's changed, though, is there are some big fundamental questions we still have. And the most important, of course, is turnout. And you know this as well as anyone, but when you look at all of the polling we've had over the last couple of years, enthusiasm to vote has been through the roof. And it has slowed down a little bit, understandably, during the time of a pandemic. But what does it look like to have enthusiasm really high, but different states imposing different rules or having different stay-at-home orders? Or if you're in the middle of a hot zone in October, how likely are you to go out and vote? And we know that if we're thinking about vote by mail, there's not going to be a national vote by mail law that's going to pass. I find that almost impossible to get through this Congress. We know that almost every battleground state, save Texas, already has vote by mail on the books. So and no excuse vote by mail. So if you want to go and vote by mail, you can. But doing that is expensive. There are cultural challenges to that. Who wants to vote by mail? Who doesn't trust voting by mail? So this is going to lead to, you know, Wisconsin was a great introduction to this. And it goes even as important to look at in Wisconsin isn't just, you know, transitioning overnight from a voting in person to a vote by mail state, but watching different communities change more quickly than others. There were some communities in and around, for example, the really wealthy suburbs of Milwaukee that sent all of its residents absentee applications. Now, if we start to see things like that happening in these battleground states, some communities have better outreach than others, certain groups voting, certain groups not. That throws all of our modeling into question, Ron.
Yeah.
You know, what we can do all the polls we want, but if people aren't actually coming to the polls, that makes a big difference. And the other thing that I think structurally has changed is that we were headed during the debate on the Democratic side. You know, we knew what the confrontation points were between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden about return to normalcy versus time for big structural revolutionary change. But we also knew that the Trump campaign was gearing up to try to make this race a choice, not a referendum on Donald Trump, but much more about a choice between a president that still majority of people say they don't particularly like, but needing to make Joe Biden even worse and to put the onus on him. And I'm sure he's not enjoying sitting in a basement in Wilmington right now, to your point, but he's also not getting the scrutiny and the attention and the, you know, all of those old votes and those problematic positions that he's taken aren't getting any oxygen right now. And that's probably a good thing for Joe Biden.
So let me, Adam, following up on what Amy noted, a lot of the questions, Raul, for example, Raul Andrews asking, the Wisconsin primary looked chaotic. As Amy noted, two things that are important. First, all of the states likely to decide the winner do have no excuse absentee balloting, right? So it's Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania went to it after 2016, as well as Wisconsin. But in many of those states, very few people have voted by mail. I mean, 1 in 20 or 1 in 25. I think a lot of questioners are asking, especially with the financial constraints of the post office, is the country prepared, our candidacies, our campaigns prepared for a world in which twice as many people nationally and maybe 10 times as many people in some of these states try to vote by mail than have done so in the past? What do you think, Adam?
I think that is a big outstanding question. And the question kind of when this all started was, are campaigns prepared to adjust to a world where they have to do all of their campaigning virtually? So there are a lot of adjustments that need to be made and need to be made quickly. But I think that as we kind of move towards the now delayed conventions and move kind of into kind of the really nitty-gritty season where you start to have some more of these primaries, we'll see if campaigns actually are ready for that. I think that there will be kind of to kind of an earlier point, this effect that if they can get people ready for that, I think the down ballot effect of all of this becomes even more important. If you're looking at say the race versus kind of how races are typically nationalized. So congressional races, Senate races are typically going to be nationalized based on any set of issues, whether that's healthcare, whether that's the performance of the president. I think that happens even more so in down ballot races, thinking state Senate, thinking your local races, and in a way that it might not have happened before.
Hey, Amy,
can I jump in on that?
Yeah, okay.
One second.
Oh.
Adam makes a really good point about down ballot races too. And just think about this beyond just how are the states going to be able to work within a world where we might be voting by mail more often, or voters are worried about standing in line. Think about a campaign that, they put their campaign plan together, and GOTV is going to start on October 1st, but your state starts mailing ballots out on September 18th, right? And so your entire campaign plan has now been upended, and the amount of money and the resources that you need to adjust to that are really substantial the lower down you get on the ballot, right? It's a big deal in some of these races to spend $100,000 or $1 million. For the presidential campaigns, they're going to be able to adjust. For the lower level races, that's a lot that they're not going to be able to afford to do.
And actually, to that point, it's more difficult now to do some of that fundraising because you can't do the in-person fundraising.
Right.
Yeah, Amy, let me stick with you. A lot of variations on the question: can Democrats take the Senate? Can Republicans take the House?
Right. I think that the more likely is Democrats taking the Senate, and to me, it really comes down to North Carolina becomes that pivotal state. It's actually, I wrote about this last week, but it is now my new favorite state because I think you get a lot of bang for the buck. It has one of only a handful of really competitive gubernatorial races, Democratic governor up for re-election. The presidential race, I think we will, if Joe Biden is able to win North Carolina, if that shows up on election night, then that, I think it's all but done that Joe Biden has won the presidency. And Tom Tillis up for re-election in North Carolina. Democrats have to pick up 4 seats because I think Alabama is going to be all but yes.
And right now they're feeling pretty good about the first 3, right? Colorado, Arizona, and even Maine.
Yeah, and they're feeling very good about North Carolina too. So there's your 4th, and then you get a little bit further down into places like Iowa or Kansas or Georgia. Those are coming online and they're competitive, but if you're really looking for the place that's going to determine, I think, control of the Senate, that's North Carolina. The House becomes much more complicated. Also, to Adam's point, if you're a challenger now, you're stuck in place. And I think Republicans had also been very much counting on Bernie Sanders as the nominee and really wanted to lean in on this socialism argument. That's off the table now, and it makes it really hard for so many of these Republican candidates, and especially in those suburban areas, to find a compelling case to make against, a Joe Biden presidency like they would have been able to make on a Sanders presidency.
By the way, it's worth noting that it wasn't only Democrats who were hoping to expand the electorate. Certainly the Trump campaign strategy in those big tipping point former blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin is registering a lot of non-college whites who haven't voted. Adam, let me ask you this interesting question, and there are versions of it. This version is Laura from Indiana asks, how do we as a society depoliticize some of the challenges the virus has highlighted, ensuring access to the vote, access to healthcare, access to technology, and technology infrastructure being just a few of those? I'm wondering, especially in some of those local candidates who try to, want to be seen as less partisan, is there any way that some of the obvious weak points or vulnerabilities in American society that have been highlighted by this can kind of escape the red-blue prism, or is that just like there's nothing that can exist beyond that in our kind of hyperpolarized moment?
Yeah, I feel like as people have been driven into their homes, it's probably only exacerbated their kind of echo chambers that they're hearing. You're driven back in front of your TV and online, so you're probably seeing a lot of the same things that you already agree with. And I don't think it's helped by these press conferences where the president talks about kind of suggest that the virus might not be as serious, or maybe that he took it more seriously than he did initially, and kind of blaming the media for any range of issues that have resulted. But I think that kind of the depoliticization of this, I don't know that it's possible that happens, because the virus and the response to the virus has been so inextricably linked to politics, and how it could have been addressed earlier, how it was not addressed earlier, and then what the response to it should be afterwards. Should we reopen the government, or should states reopen their economies at an earlier date or at a later date. So there are just so many kind of fundamental things, including the access to hospitals. So not even just access to the ballot, but like access to really fundamental things like hospitals and groceries that are still being kind of politicized in this one.
You know, Amy, to that point, I mean, there's debate about there's still debate about among epidemiologists about whether this will ultimately reach and really besiege all parts of the country. But so far, there's no question that the burden of the disease has been heavier in the big metros that are leaning, that have become increasingly democratic in literally every state, I think, and much less intense health concerns in not all, but in most rural small town areas. Do you think that it's possible that the way this disease is kind of unfolding further accentuates that kind of town and country divide that has been such a characteristic of the Trump era?
Absolutely, and it just makes just one more sort of cultural touchstone, right? Whether you wear a mask or whether you don't becomes the new, are you carrying a bag to Whole Foods? Or are you driving your pickup truck to the local grocery store moment, right? And this idea too about that you were talking about in the first panel about that tension between the economy and health. It's something that, again, if you are in the areas of work like we are, where we can pretty easily telework, then yeah, it's pretty easy to have your cultural signaling on with your stay at home and don't go outside. And I'm going to shame people on social media for not appropriately, distancing themselves. It becomes a lot harder in those more rural regions or where people are working in jobs that they cannot telecommute to. What I start to wonder though, Ron, is what happens though, as we've seen in a place like South Dakota, when it really does hit in those regions, and does it change the perceptions of the people who live in and around it? Or because it's only hitting certain sectors within those areas. So for example, in South Dakota, it's a meat packing plant. We know that there are a lot of folks in there. These are lower income folks. These are most likely voters of color. That is also going to be an exacerbating factor. So I theoretically, what pandemics are supposed to do is sort of equalize us. Nobody's safe from a virus. Everybody will know somebody who's been impacted. But more and more, it seems like what we will see are people who have this unbelievably indelible experience. If you live in New York right now, you probably know somebody who is sick. You might know somebody who has died. If you live in another part of the country, you may never know anybody who has gone through this.
Let me ask Adam, clock's ticking, but let me ask a really interesting question from Andrew here. Wondering if, given the magnitude of the challenges that emerged in the wake of the COVID crisis, do you think the Democratic platform will embrace a more change-driven agenda? In other words, will Biden have to scale up his proposal, something along the Sanders-Warren continuum, in order to meet this moment?
I think that that kind of scaling up his progressive platform was likely going to happen regardless. I think it's kind of made more potent by this moment, because if you looked at, of course, 2016 with free college, where Hillary Clinton initially said that, I don't believe college should be free, I think it should be affordable. And then by July, she was endorsing a free college plan of, anyone under $140,000 a year was able to get tuition-free college. So I think that sort of movement to kind of gain some of those voters was always going to happen. But I think that it's become more potent in this moment. And I think that does kind of color how exactly the plans are scaled up.
Yeah,
Amy, a final word. Whose hand would you rather have at this point, Donald Trump's or Joe Biden's?
I mean, I think Joe Biden has more paths to 270 than Donald Trump does. And so I think I would rather be in that position right now. I mean, the one thing that Joe Biden doesn't have as much of as Trump is money, but I think that's easier to solve than some of the challenges that Donald Trump has.
Of Great. Adam, Amy, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining us and sharing your insights. And that wraps it up for this eventcast. Thank all of you out there for joining us. For the latest information on the pandemic, please visit theatlantic.com and please keep an eye out for future upcoming events. I'm Ron Brownstein in Los Angeles. Thank you all for joining us.